Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/BrianEDenton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 222. Chapter 222. Prince Andrew's regiment was among the reserves which till after 1 o'clock were stationed inactive behind Semenovsk under heavy artillery fire. Toward 2 o'clock the regiment, having already lost more than 200 men, was moved forward into a trampled oat field in the gap between Semenovsk and the Knoll Battery, where thousands of men perished that day, and on which an intense, concentrated fire from several hundred enemy guns was directed between 1 and 2 o'clock. Without moving from that spot or firing a single shot, the regiment here lost another third of its men. From in front, and especially from the right, and the unlifting smoke the guns boomed, and out of the mysterious domain of smoke that overlay the whole space in front, quick hissing cannonballs and slow whistling shells flew unceasingly. At times, as if to allow them a respite, a quarter of an hour passed during which the cannonballs and shells all flew overhead, but sometimes several men were torn from the regiment in a minute, and the slain were continually being dragged away and the wounded carried off. With each fresh blow, less and less chance of life remained for those not yet killed. The regiment stood in columns of battalion, 300 paces apart, but nevertheless the men were always in one and the same mood. All alike were taciturn and morose. Talk was rarely heard in the ranks, and it ceased altogether every time the thud of a successful shot and the cry of "Stretchers!" was heard. Most of the time, by their officer's order, the men sat on the ground. One, having taken off his shako, carefully loosened the gathers of its lining and drew them tight again. Another, rubbing some dry clay between his palms, polished his bayonet. Another fingered the strap and pulled the buckle of his bandolier, while another smoothed and refolded his leg bands and put his boots on again. Some built little houses of the tufts in the plowed ground, or plaited baskets from the straw in the cornfield. All seemed fully absorbed in these pursuits. When men were killed or wounded, when rows of stretchers went past, when some troops retreated and then great masses of the enemy came into view through the smoke, no one paid any attention to these things. But when our artillery cavalry advanced, or some of our infantry were seen to move forward, words of approval were heard on all sides. But the liveliest attention was attracted by occurrences quite apart from and unconnected with the battle. It was as if the minds of these morally exhausted men found relief in everyday, commonplace occurrences. A battery of artillery was passing in front of the regiment. The horse of an ammunition cart put its leg over a trace. "Hey, look at that trace horse! Get her leg out! She'll fall! Ah, they don't see it!" came identical shouts from the ranks all along the regiment. Another time, general attention was attracted by a small brown dog, coming heaven knows whence, which trotted in a preoccupied manner in front of the ranks, with tail stiffly erect, till suddenly a shell fell close by, when it yelped, tucked its tail between its legs, and darted aside. Yells and shrieks of laughter rose from the whole regiment. But such distractions lasted only a moment, and for 8 hours the men had been inactive, without food, in constant fear of death, and their pale and gloomy faces grew even paler and gloomier. Prince Andrew, pale and gloomy like everyone in the regiment, paced up and down from the border of one patch to another, at the edge of the meadow beside an oat field, with head bowed and arms behind his back. There was nothing for him to do, and no orders to be given. Everything went on of itself. The killed were dragged from the front, the wounded carried away, and the ranks closed up. If any soldiers ran to the rear, they returned immediately and hastily. At first, Prince Andrew, considering it his duty to rouse the courage of the men and to set them an example, walked about among the ranks. But he soon became convinced that this was unnecessary, and that there was nothing he could teach them. All the powers of his soul, as of every soldier there, were unconsciously bent on avoiding the contemplation of the horrors of the situation. He walked along the meadow, dragging his feet, rustling the grass, and gazing at the dust that covered his boots. Now he took big strides, trying to keep to the footprints left on the meadow by the mowers. Then he counted his steps, calculating how often he must walk from one strip to another to walk a mile. Then he stripped the flowers from the wormwood that grew along the boundary rut, rubbed them in his palms, and smelled their pungent, sweet, bitter scent. Nothing remained of the previous day's thoughts. He thought of nothing. He listened with wary ears to the ever-recurring sounds, distinguishing the whistle of flying projectiles from the booming of the reports, glanced at the tiresomely familiar faces of the men of the battalion, and waited. "Here it comes! This one is coming our way again," he thought, listening to an approaching whistle in the hidden region of the smoke. "One, another, again, it has hit." He stopped and looked at the ranks. No, it has gone over. But this one has hit. And again he started trying to reach the boundary strip in 16 paces. A whiz and a thud. 5 paces from him, a cannonball tore up the dry earth and disappeared. A chill ran down his back. Again he glanced at the ranks. Probably many had been hit. A large crowd had gathered near the 2nd Battalion. "Adjutant!" he shouted. "Order them not to crowd together." The adjutant, having obeyed this instruction, approached Prince Andrew. From the other side, a battalion commander rode up. "Look out!" came a frightened cry from a soldier, and, like a bird whirring in rapid flight and alighting on the ground, a shell dropped with little noise within 2 steps of Prince Andrew and close to the battalion commander's horse. The horse first, regardless of whether it was right or wrong to show fear, snorted, reared almost throwing the major, and galloped aside. The horse's terror infected the men. "Lie down!" cried the adjutant, throwing himself flat on the ground. Prince Andrew hesitated. The smoking shell spun like a top between him and the prostrate adjutant, near a wormwood plant, between the field and the meadow. "Can this be death?" thought Prince Andrew, looking with a quite new envious glance at the grass, the wormwood, and the streamlet of smoke that curled up from the rotating black ball. I do not wish to die. I love life. I love this grass, this earth, this air." He thought this, and at the same time remembered that people were looking at him. "It's shameful, sir," he said to the adjutant. "What—" He did not finish speaking. At one and the same moment came a sound of an explosion, a whistle of splinters, as from a breaking window frame, a suffocating smell of powder, and Prince Andrew started to one side, raising his arm, and fell on his chest. Several officers ran up to him. From the right side of his abdomen, blood was welling out, making a large stain on the grass. The militiamen with stretchers who were called up stood behind the officers. Prince Andrew lay on his chest with his face in the grass, breathing heavily and noisily. "What are you waiting for? Come along!" The peasants went up and took him by his shoulders and legs, but he moaned piteously, and exchanging looks, they set him down again. "Pick him up! Lift him! It's all the same!" cried someone. They again took him by the shoulders and laid him on the stretcher. "Ah, God, my God, what is it? The stomach? That means death, my God!" voices among the officers were heard saying. "It flew a hair's breadth past my ear," said the adjutant. The peasants, adjusting the stretcher to their shoulders, started hurriedly along the path they had trodden down to the dressing station. "Keep in step! Ah, those peasants!" shouted an officer, seizing by their shoulders and checking the peasants, who were walking unevenly and jolting the stretcher. "Get into step, Fyodor! Get into step, Fyodor!" said the foremost peasant. "Now that's right," said the one behind joyfully, when he got into step. "Your Excellency! Prince!" said the trembling voice of Timokhin, who had run up and was looking down on the stretcher. Prince Andrew opened his eyes and looked up at the speaker from the stretcher, into which his head had sunk deep, and again his eyelids drooped. The militiamen carried Prince Andrew to the dressing station by the wood, where wagons were stationed. The dressing station consisted of 3 tents with flaps turned back, pitched at the edge of a birch wood. In the wood, wagons and horses were standing. The horses were eating oats from their movable troughs, and sparrows fled down and pecked the grains that fell. Some crows, scenting blood, flew among the birch trees, cawing impatiently. Around the tents, over more than 5 acres, blood-stained men in various garbs stood, sat, or lay. Around the wounded stood crowds of soldier stretcher-bearers with dismal and attentive faces, whom the officers, keeping order, tried in vain to drive from the spot. Disregarding the officers' orders, the soldiers stood leaning against their stretchers and gazing intently, as if trying to comprehend the difficult problem of what was taking place before them. From the tents came now loud, angry cries, and now plaintive groans. Occasionally, dressers ran out to fetch water, or to point out those who were to be brought in next. The wounded men awaiting their turn outside the tents groaned, sighed, wept, screamed, swore, or asked for vodka. Some were delirious. Prince Andrew's bearers, stepping over the wounded who had not yet been bandaged, took him, as a regimental commander, close up to one of the tents, and there stopped, awaiting instructions. Prince Andrew opened his eyes, and for a long time could not make out what was going on around him. He remembered the meadow, the wormwood, the field, the whirling black ball, and a sudden rush of passionate love of life. 2 steps from him, leaning against a branch, and talking loudly and attracting general attention, stood a tall, handsome, black-haired, non-commissioned officer with a bandaged head. He had been wounded in the head and leg by bullets. Around him, eagerly listening to his talk, a crowd of wounded and stretcher-bearers was gathered. "We kicked him out of there, so he chucked everything. We grabbed the king himself," cried he, looking around him with eyes that glittered with fever. "If only reserves had come up just then, lads, there wouldn't have been nothing left of him. I tell you, surely." Like all the others near the speaker, Prince Andrew looked at him with shining eyes and experienced a sense of comfort. "But it's all the same now," thought he. "And what will be there? And what has there been here? Why was I so reluctant to part with life? There was something in this life I did not and do not understand." And that concludes my reading of chapter 222. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 222. Fear of Death. Angry cries and plaintive groans, morally exhausted men contemplating the horrors of their situation. It's either a Mets fan support group or the Battle of Borodino from the Russia perspective. As it turns out, this is Tolstoy after all, it is indeed the Battle of Borodino, and here, in today's chapter, Tolstoy treats us to one of life's great fears, the fear of death. Prince Andrew's regiment is in trouble. They're inoperative and stuck amid a massive concentration of enemy gun and cannon fire. Nothing can be done about it. They cannot move. They can only wait, hoping that death spares them just a moment longer. In an effort to calm themselves, the men attempt to find relief in everyday common occurrences. Yells and shrieks of laughter arose from the whole regiment, Tolstoy writes. But such distractions lasted only a moment, and for 8 hours the men had been inactive, without food, and constant fear of death, and their pale and gloomy faces grew ever paler and gloomier. Prince Andrew is about to get a lot paler and a lot gloomier. A shell explodes next to him, opening a giant wound in his stomach. As his body falls to the ground and he is transferred to the field hospital, his soul is savaged by the fear of death. He feels a sudden urge to live, a profound love of and attachment to life. Daily meditation. He who fears death either fears the loss of sensation or a different kind of sensation. But if thou shalt have no sensation, neither wilt thou feel any harm. And if thou shalt acquire another kind of sensation, that will be a different kind of living being, and thou wilt not cease to live. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. And that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 222 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening with me today. If you like what you're hearing and you want to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 223. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.